South Wales. The Ukraine war is now entering, its 7th week? And it remains, I think, or increasingly a matter of concern and uncertainty, even to those of us here on the other side of the world. Each suggestion of negotiation or compromise seems to be followed by new reports of attacks and cruelties. What will happen next? Are there two sides to the discussion? Are there two sides to the controversy? Our speaker tonight will be able to give us some insights onto that question. Emeritus Professor Graham Gill, Emeritus Professor at the University of Sydney, has a long and very eminent career as a social scientist and a political analyst, including substantial histories of the Soviet Union up to its collapse in 1991. He was Professor of International Relations at the University of Sydney, and he's a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences. The list goes on, but I won't waste your time with any more. I'm going to hand over to Professor Graham Gill to talk on Russia after Ukraine.
Thank you, Ian. I'm very pleased to be here. It's really nice to be able to get out again and see happy faces rather than looking at the picture of yourself in the computer as you talk to disembodied voices from various parts of the country. What I'm going to try and do tonight is to talk basically about Russia. We don't hear very much about Russia in terms of the Ukraine war, and I'm going to concentrate principally upon the impact of that war on Russia at this stage, where it might be going. I'm certainly happy during question time to talk more directly about the war if you want. I think the one thing that's clear already from the war is that it was, despite what the presidential spokesperson in Russia says, it was a terrible mistake on the part of Putin to go in. Putin basically made 3 wrong assumptions. He assumed the Russian army would be much better at fighting than it appears to have been, or at least those sections of the army which were sent into Ukraine, because let's be clear, a significant part of the Russian military has not been engaged in Ukrainian events. But he underestimated Russian military capacity. He underestimated the level of resistance that would come from the Ukrainians, and that's because not that he was isolated in a room, not because he was misled about Ukrainian military capacity, but because he completely and utterly misunderstood the nature of the Ukrainian relationship to the Russians. And again, I'm happy to talk about that later too. And the third thing that he misunderstood was the Western response. He assumed that even if his initial strategy of getting to Kiev quickly, replacing the government quickly, would happen before the West could respond, even if he assumed that wasn't going to happen quickly, he assumed that the West would not respond in the way that it has. He assumed that the West would be too divided to respond, if they responded at all. Despite Biden's comments leading up to the invasion, he assumed that it would be like Barack Obama in the Syrian conflict, when Obama said, "We have one red line, and that's if you use chemical weapons, we will respond." So Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons, and Obama turned his back. Putin assumed that the same would apply here. So this terrible misconception on his part has led to this sort of quagmire that we're in at the moment. And what I want to look at is basically the effect of that, the effect that has had on Russia itself. We know the effect it's having on Ukraine, but we don't know what effect it's having on Russia. And I want to talk about three different aspects of that. One is the effect of sanctions. One is to address the question that many people raise about whether Putin is going to become politically vulnerable as a result of it. And thirdly, I'd like to say something about the sort of political forces that it has unleashed within Russia. So firstly, Western sanctions. Well, Western sanctions have clearly had an impact. The freezing of bank assets by the West, including some assets held by the central bank, which is of course the nuclear option, because central banks have always in the past been excluded from sanctions. The freezing of banking assets, the constraints on trade, the constraints on travel, the way in which Western companies have closed or suspended their operations there, and in particular the closure of Visa and MasterCard, all of these have had a direct impact. It led initially to a run on the banks. We saw the pictures of people lining up to try and take their money out. It led to a fall in the ruble of something like 30% overnight. It's now regained most of that. It's led to higher interest rates. The interest rate was doubled, and it's led to higher inflation. And what this means in the short term is, of course, increased hardship for the populace. It's become more difficult to live. It's become more difficult to get by because there are shortages in the shops. There is uncertainty about the future of employment for many people. Some factories have either closed or gone on short-time working. So there's increasing underemployment as well. And this is really important because the Russian system does not have a very strong welfare net. It's got a welfare net, but it's a welfare net which has got a lot of holes in it. And the more unemployment there is, the more uncertainty there is, the more people are going to be plunged into poverty and despair. Now, I don't want you to get the idea that I am saying that therefore the Russian people have it as bad as people in many parts of Ukraine have it, because I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that the effect of going in is having an effect on the economy, and that effect is having a knockdown effect on the populace. It's unclear precisely what sort of long-term effect the sanctions will have. Even if we were to assume that the Western powers were able to retain their unity and to retain those sanctions for a prolonged period of time, which I doubt and I'll get on to later, it's by no means clear that those sanctions would cripple the economy. And that's because, in one form or another, Russia has been operating under Western economic sanctions since 1974. This is when the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was introduced in the US, which was related to Jewish immigration. Certainly, the sanctions now are much heavier than they've ever been before, but the effect of sanctions is, and there are some figures which will support this later, the effect of sanctions has been to actually increase levels of support for Putin, and it has not eroded levels of support for the involvement in Ukraine. So there's no evidence that I'm aware of that sanctions are a particularly effective instrument of politics, particularly if those applying the sanctions are unclear about what they're meant to achieve. What are the Western sanctions on Russia meant to achieve? Are they meant to affect the conduct of the war? Are they meant to affect, are they meant to try to persuade Russia to pull out? Or are they meant to do damage to the economy as a whole? It's unclear. Certainly, the EU president has said the aim of the sanctions is to damage the economy. Well, if the aim of the sanctions is to damage the economy, what sort of impact do you think that would have domestically on popular support? Just going to increase a rally around the flag effect. So the sanctions, as I say, are having an effect. What they will do in the long term, we don't know. Okay, what about the erosion of Putin's position? There's been some talk that the catastrophic mistake that he made in going into Ukraine will erode his support within Russia. There are two levels of this that I want to look at. One is among the elite, and the second one is among the broad populace. Now, the literature tells us that these sorts of regimes, authoritarian regimes, particularly where you have a strong personalist leader, when they fall, they tend to fall most times because of splits within the elite. Not people marching in the streets, not revolution. Revolution is obviously the most sort of striking instance of this, but most of these regimes fall as a result of division within the ruling group. Is there any sign of division within the group around Putin? Well, there is some evidence that some people in the leading group are unhappy about what's happened. Some people have come out publicly and said, in one way or another, this is a bad idea. Some people have actually left the country. But they have tended to be the oligarchs, that is, the economic bigwigs, if you like, and they are the oligarchs in the private sector of the economy. There are two sectors in Russia. There's the public and the private. The public, or the state sector, is much, much bigger than it is in most other countries, and it's run by people who owe their positions by and large to Putin. Most of those in the private sector also owe their positions by and large to Putin. But the critics, such as they are, have come essentially from that private sector. But I don't want to overemphasise their degree of opposition. I mean, basically most of them have said, Vladimir, this is a bad idea, and that's been the extent of it. It's been published, but it's not as though they've gone on a campaign. It's not as though they've been lobbying or anything like that. They've simply expressed reservations about it. Among the state managers, if you like, the people in the economy who run the state sector of the economy, we haven't seen any of that. But of course, what people have argued since Putin came to power is that Putin is simply the representative of what they call the siloviki. This is the people who run the intelligence service, the secret police, the military, the militia, and so forth. That Putin is one of these. Putin certainly did spend time in the KGB. But these are the people who generally are seen as being most influential in Russia. And we've seen no split among these. We have seen, it's difficult to know what it is. Before going in, I think it was the 21st of February, there was a televised meeting of the Security Council, which you may have seen, because bits of it were on the news. And it showed Putin at one end of the room, and all these guys sitting down here. And these were the heads of the security services and the military and so forth. And Putin went around one by one, asking them what they thought of Russia recognising the two self-proclaimed independent republics in Ukraine. a majority of the people went around, either didn't know that this was going to be asked of them, or were not sure about it, because they stumbled around, they bumbled around, and Putin was sort of, you know, tell me what you think, tell me what you think. In other words, tell me what you want me to hear. So we don't really know whether this group, the Siloviki, agrees with going in or not. But this is the group with military experience, if you like, who must know that this is such a disaster for Russia going in the way that they did. And this is the group, or from within this group, if there is going to be a challenge to Putin, it's likely to come from them, because they understand that the depth of the problem in Ukraine. These are also the groups who, because of the nature of what they do, of what the police do, of what the security services do, they also understand what's going on the ground in Russia. And so if there's signs of potential unhappiness, unrest in Russia, they're going to be the ones who know about it. Therefore, if there is to be a move against him, it would come from there. Personally, I think it's unlikely that he'll be removed. I think it is possible, depends on how the Ukraine situation works out, but I think what is likely is that there might be a tap on the shoulder, and they'll say to Putin, next presidential election is 2024. We know we've changed the constitution so you can run again, but don't run. This may give Putin a face-saving way out, and it would also lead to a change in leadership. But that's pure speculation. There is no evidence of that at this stage. Now, what about the opposition? Well, there has been limited opposition. There have been demonstrations. Something like 15,000 people, I think, have been arrested across the country. It sounds a lot in a population of 146 million. It's probably not all that great, but nevertheless, it's there. But what I would suggest is that opposition is unlikely to snowball unless things get really bad. If we look at Putin's approval rating, for example, there are three public opinion polling bodies in Russia. Two are connected with the government and one's independent, and it's pretty good in what it does. And according to the independent one, Putin's approval rating in November of last year was 63%. Pretty good approval rating. I mean, it's dropped from what it was in the past, but it's pretty good approval rating. It's something sort of Scott Morrison would kill for, I suspect. In February of this year, it was 71%. So this is before they went into Ukraine. In March of this year, it was 83%. In February of this year, 60% of people who were surveyed believed that the US and NATO were mainly responsible for the Ukrainian tensions. So for them, Putin is defending. He's not being an aggressor. This month, 80% of people support actions in Ukraine. 80%. Now, it's important to recognise that what they support is the image of the war that they get. And the image of the war that they get and the narrative that goes along with it is very different from the image that we get. What they support is what Putin called the special military operation to get rid of the Nazis in Ukraine and to defend both Russians who were there, but also Ukrainians So what I'm suggesting here is that there is a very strong body of popular support behind Putin and behind the war. But of course, this is reinforced, if you like, by the way in which there's been a crackdown, both since the war started, but also in the period leading up to it. There's been a crackdown on independent activity and oppositional activity. The last two major independent press outlets have been closed. There have been social media restrictions placed on social media, particularly on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. So what it means is that the press that's available to Russians is, by and large, one that toes the government line. I've said figures show that something like 60% of Russians get their news daily from the television, and the television is aligned with the Kremlin. I think it's 28% get their news from the internet. But there are constraints on the internet now. There isn't the great Chinese firewall in Russia. It's still much freer than that, but there are nevertheless constraints. So the channels for getting information are very largely controlled by the government. So while Russians are seeing pictures of atrocities, pictures of the result of atrocities, those are attributed, that just goes to reinforce the argument that the Nazis are in Ukraine and in control of Ukraine, and they're what our boys are fighting against. There's been a repression of protests. Restrictions have been put on about protesting, and those protests that have been called have been vigorously repressed by the police, with those arrests that I talked about before, and many more people are picked up by the police, taken in, given a talking to, and let go, who don't appear in that sort of 15,000 figure. But there has been clearly increased repression of protest compared with, say, 5 years ago. And there's been the closure, and this is really sort of symbolic rather than having any direct practical effect. There's been the closure of Memorial. Memorial was a human rights organisation set up in 1990 in order to investigate the deaths during the Stalinist terror. And it's got a fabulous reputation. It runs a museum, the Gulag Museum. It's got a big archive that people can go to find out about their relatives and what happened to them. And it's been a major spokesperson spokes-organisation, whatever the word is, for human rights. And that's been closed down. It's been called a foreign agent. Legislation about foreign agents was introduced about 8 years ago. Any organisation, and now any person who receives any funding from abroad, has to register as a foreign agent. Now, it's not illegal, but foreign agent has a really nasty ring about it in terms of Soviet history, because this was the term that was used during the terror in the 30s to talk about people who suffered. And finally, in this about the population, the president of the Ukraine, the presentation of the Ukrainian operation, as I hinted at before, it's talked about as a special military operation against the Nazis, not against the Ukrainian people. The media is not allowed to use the term war. It must use special military operation, which of course seems to imply limited action as opposed to a widespread. So there doesn't appear to be a great deal of scope for popular opposition to emerge. What has emerged and this is really worrying, is that Putin has opened the door to mainstream Russian politics for extreme right-wing organisations. Putin has for a long time had close associations with the Western observers call them neo-Nazi organisations. They're certainly extreme right. They often dress in black, and they are militant. You know, they go out and they beat people up who have opposite points of view. Putin has been associated with these, but for a long time, despite that association, they've been relatively marginalised in Russian mainstream politics. The language that Putin has used with regard to Ukraine has effectively legitimised a lot of the sort of activity that these groups seek to be involved in. Putin has talked about the need for, quote, a natural and necessary self-cleansing of society in order to bring about unity in Russia. He has counterposed patriots to traitors. He's talked about the need to oppose the fifth column within the society, which is working for Western interests to try to bring about regime change and social change in Russia. What this does is that it legitimises the extreme right-wing activity that these groups are involved in. It delegitimises people who take positions of opposition to the Ukrainian war, and it delegitimises people who simply may have contacts with the West or are seen as being sympathetic to the West or interested in a Western style of life, if you like. It's unclear where the boundaries are, but what it is very dangerous. But what it also does is that it feeds into the narrative which Putin has been running for a long time about Russia being under attack from the West, and the the special military operation in Ukraine is to blunt that attack. And listen, can't we see the truth of this argument about the West trying to undermine us? Look at the sanctions. It all gets bound up into the narrative that's been presented in such a way as to reinforce extreme right-wing and extreme nationalist views. I think I'm just about out of time. But what I just want to say is there a way out? And the West has got an important role to play here. In the West, there are essentially two polarised views. First is that Russia is inherently aggressive and expansionist. And Ukraine is pointed to as an example of that view, proof of that view. The other view is that Russia is mainly reactive, and that, if anything, Russia might even be frightened of the technologically superior West, frightened of the West's soft power. This is what the fifth column stuff is about. Now, sooner or later, the West has to decide whether it's going to continue punishing Russia for what it's done, and the likely outcome of that is that it pushes it more and more to become a North Korea, if you like, a pariah state with many more nuclear weapons than North Korea has, or whether it seeks some accommodation. And if it does seek some accommodation, that will require some resolution of the Ukrainian issue. The problem is that the language in the West at the moment is clearly not about seeking an accommodation. it's clearly about punishing as much as they can. And I think what that will do is that it will only reinforce the problems that we have, and it will not get to the root cause of the Ukrainian invasion. It will not get to the root problem as far as the Russians see it, and therefore if we continue to go down that track, we are likely to see the continuation of very bad relations between Russia and at least the rest of Europe, but maybe not the world. Thank you.
We now have the best part of 30 minutes for questions. For those of you watching online, feel free to use the Q&A function that you'll find on your Zoom screen and address your questions to our moderator, who will pass them on to the room. And to those of you here in the room, there's going to be a moving mic so that your question can be heard not only here in the room but also on our broadcast. So over to our first questioner, Chris Skinner.
Chris Skinner. According to the Russian Foreign Minister, the motivation of their invasion of the Ukraine was partially motivated by the ethnic cleansing that they accused the Ukrainians of undertaking over the last 8+ years. And of course the other reason is the encroachment of NATO. To what degree has Russia raised either or both of those points through the United Nations over the period since 2008?
Since 2008. I don't know to what extent it's been raised through the UN. I think what is interesting is that before the invasion took place, but after the troops were massing around the border, a series of meetings took place anyway, between the Russians on the one hand and various Western countries on the other. But when those meetings were sort of about to start, Putin said, "These are the things that I want us to negotiate about, to talk about." And he had about 4 or 5 things. One of them was the ethnic cleansing. But the first two were no Ukraine in NATO, no NATO forces on Russia's borders. Biden and Stoltenberg immediately said, they're off the table. We're not going to negotiate about them at all. So I think the issue of NATO membership is actually tied up with this completely, but it's also linked to the points you make about claimed ethnic cleansing. Now, there's not a lot of evidence of ethnic cleansing taking place in Ukraine. There is evidence of continuing conflict across the ceasefire line of the Donbass, where something like 14 or 15,000 people have died over the last 8 years. There have been Russian ethnic citizens and there have been Ukrainian ethnic citizens, but that's not ethnic cleansing. But what the Russians claim is that Ukraine is dominated or has been taken over by Nazis. Now, there are clearly right-wing groups within Ukraine that have been active both in Kyiv, particularly around 2014 and the Maidan Revolution, but also in that Donbass borderland, where in particular the Azov Brigade, which is began as an extreme right-wing militia organisation which has been taken into the Ukrainian army, that's been active as well. And the Russians have seen this, and that's the basis for their claim about ethnic cleansing, I think. But Putin has this view that Russians and Ukrainians are basically the same people, that they share a history, they share a culture, They are one and the same. They have been divided only because of historical decisions that were made before. And being Russians, like being essentially Russians, they want to be with their fellow Russians in Russia itself. If they don't want to be, it can only be because they are working for foreign powers. And those foreign powers, i.e. the US and the EU, are seen by Putin in the form in which they act in Ukraine as fascists. So the argument that you see presented that it's stupid to say that they've gone in to get rid of Nazis because they've got a Jewish president misses the point of the conception that Putin seems to have, and it's a conception that is, if the Ukrainians have sort of strayed from the path, if you like, it's because of the malign influence of these groups. There's frightening stuff that's appeared in the Russian press. There's an article that came out in the Novosti, which is a major Russian news outlet, where the guy argues that getting rid of the Nazis in Ukraine is going to take 30 years. And it's going to take 30 years because it's not just this small group, might be at the top, but there are Nazis sort of infiltrated right throughout the community. So I suppose in answer to your question, I don't know whether they've brought it up in NATO, but in the UN. But I think they have been upfront about NATO and the claim about genocide, but I don't think there's any basis for that.
Do we have a question online? Let's go.
Yes, we have a question from Penny Wensley, and she asks, where does the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov sit in relation to the group of the influential people you described from the military security services?
Sorry, I can't hear what you're saying.
Where does Sergei Lavrov sit in relation to that group of influential people you were describing?
I think in most political systems, the foreign minister tends not to be one of the inner circle generally. And Lavrov has been foreign minister for a very long time. Competent guy, basically does what Putin says. There's not a great deal of evidence to suggest that he's one of Putin's intimates. And certainly when there is discussion of the group who would have been advising Putin about the Ukrainian invasion, his name is not mentioned. So I think he's not one of the intimates.
Another question from here in the room.
Dean Morelli, how do you interpret the recent arrest and imprisonment of some of the upper echelons of the SFB? Very strange move. The successor of the KGB.
Okay, it's not clear actually what has happened. There's been reported about the arrest of a number of second-level officers in the FSB, which is the Domestic Intelligence Service, and the continuation of the KGB. It's not clear. Sorry, it's said that they've been sacked. It's not clear whether they've been sacked or some of them have voluntarily left, whether they've retired or not. We don't know. But one thing that is clear is that if Putin thought that the Russian troops were going to be widely welcomed by the Ukrainian populace, that view must have been supported or put to him by some of the intelligence services. I mean, I think he had this view basically right from the start anyway, because of his perception of the historic nature of the relationship between the two. But you would have thought that the people on the ground, and the Russians apparently had a very good intelligence network in Ukraine, that the people on the ground would have been saying, feeding up the line, look, the Ukrainians are not going to be mad keen on Russian troops coming in to rescue them. And therefore, one assumes that that message must have had to have come through the FSB. Now, it may be that these guys chose, you know, you tell the king what he wants to hear, you don't tell him what he doesn't want to hear, and so the higher up it got, the less the message, less clarity there was of the message. That may be it, but we don't know. We're just guessing. But I mean, one thing is clear. I mean, despite what they say, it's been a disaster for Russia. Been a disaster for the military. It's been a disaster for them internationally. They've achieved exactly the reverse of everything that they've been trying to achieve over the last 20 years or so in international politics. And so someone is going to pay. Someone is going to pay. We just don't know who it is. It may be these people are the first cabs off the rank. Historically, Putin has generally not brought down the axe immediately someone has made a mistake. Usually what happens is that they're left in office for a little while and then they're moved out and given another soft job somewhere else. There are a few exceptions, but most people who have been removed, that was the pattern. And so I would expect to see changes when the Ukrainian situation is a bit closer to hopefully the end of it than we are now. But it's interesting that that's happened. I mean, the other possibility, and what some people hope, is that what this suggests is that there might be a group among the Siloviki who might be willing to try to remove Putin. But again, we have absolutely no evidence that that's the case. I mean, that's the trouble with these regimes. They don't really tell us what's going on all the time.
Next question from here in the room. Alison Bronowski.
Thank you. I'm Alison Bronowski. I'm a member of the Institute, and thank you for your illuminating discussion of this tonight. We don't see that much sense a lot in our media. Can I just remind you that when a Russian delegation and a Ukrainian delegation met in Istanbul, they actually came to a sort of an agreement about the points that were to be made to each of their governments about finding a solution to the war. Now, that appeared to be very encouraging, and very soon after it, we heard from Biden that there was no way that this was going to end so soon, and that as far as he was concerned, America was involved for a very long time, and that he was more or less sending a message that the United States didn't want to see this kind of resolution anytime soon. I suspect myself that this whole episode, ever since 2014, has been an effort on the part of the United States to displace Putin himself. What would you say about that?
I'm unsure of the chronology. I mean, I think the talks, the possibility of negotiated settlement, I think was quite strong. At least both sides seem to be saying it was, until the discovery of the atrocities in Bucha. And that's when Zelensky walked back his commitment to negotiate. Now, I don't, is American policy about regime change? Look, I don't buy the conspiratorial argument, but I do think that the Americans have this view, as I was telling the interns before, it's reflected in the memoirs of Obama's ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul. McFaul is a Russian specialist at Stanford. He helped Obama with foreign policy advice in Obama's first term. And in his second term, Obama tapped him as ambassador to Moscow. Now, McFaul hates Putin, and the feelings are reversed. You know, it's quite clear. But after he went back into academia, McFaul wrote his memoirs of his time in Moscow, and he said, "When I was going to Moscow," and I'm paraphrasing, when I was going to Moscow, I knew that I had two tasks. One was to protect American interests and further American interests, and one was to promote democratisation. Now, if you're going to an authoritarian country, which they said it was at that stage, isn't promoting democratisation actually promoting regime change? Yes. So Biden's slip of the tongue about, you know, God, he can't remain in power, can he, sort of thing, actually I think does reflect American preferences, and it reflects the way in which America has approached not just this region but other regions as well. I mean, if you look at the sanctions have been imposed basically by the G20. 141 countries voted to condemn Russia in the UN General Assembly. 35 abstained and about 5 voted against it. But of those 141, how many have imposed sanctions? As I say, it's only about the G20. No, very few, if any, of the others have. That's not because they agree with what Russia is doing in Ukraine. They don't agree with the invasion. So why don't they take practical action? And in part, I think, it's because they accept part of the Russian narrative. And that Russian narrative is that the US is about regime change. The Russians have argued this ever since the colour revolutions. Right? The revolutions in 2003, 4 and 5 in Georgia, Kyrgyzstan and Ukraine, and an earlier one in Serbia. These were all popularly based movements, but they all got significant support from the West. Same with the 2014 Maidan revolution. So the Russians have been saying ever since then, what the Americans are about is regime change. And the Ukrainian issue is just another aspect of that. And I think they're right. I think the Americans would like to bring about regime change. But I think that argument that the Americans want to engineer, you know, the removal of a leader rings a lot of bells elsewhere in the world. And I think that's why there's much less support for the Western position, or much less strong support for the Western position than you might assume. Certainly listening to our media, you'd think that everybody's against Russia.
If I could just leap out of my assigned role and ask a follow-up question to Alison's, how do you perceive American economic objectives in all this? I'm thinking obviously of things like who supplies energy to Western Europe, and also perceptions they may have of the kind of economy that Ukraine should have and how it participates in the Western Europe and in the wider economy.
Well, I read something somewhere that talked about the Americans watching on while Europe gradually strangled itself. You know, if you look at the sanctions, I mean, all right, the Americans may suffer a bit, but they're not going to suffer anywhere near as much as the Europeans are if those sanctions are maintained. And so, if you have a sort of a view of the world which says that the US wants to become the dominant superpower again and it wants to keep everybody down, well then you could argue that this fits in with that view. I mean, I don't think that's right, but there is certainly an argument to be had about it. I mean, what does it want? What does it want Ukraine to do? I think it would like Ukraine just to continue to produce wheat and to send it, because it wants to stabilise the international wheat market. I mean, that's the whole thing about the sanctions, and whether they can last or not. The sanctions are really going to bite the West as well, and the level of impact will increase over time, not just because of the disruption to wheat supplies, but because of the rise in oil prices, which has occurred, and because Russia has significant resources of the fine metals that are needed for a variety of things that the West does. It has a monopoly on the largest supply of titanium, for example, which you need for planes and things. So it's by no means clear that when you weigh up the costs on both sides, Russia on the one hand, the West on the other, it's by no means clear that Russia is going to be the only loser in all of this. But in the West, I think America will be less of a loser than Europe is.
Thank you. Question here.
Thanks, Bob Lowry. The picture you paint of the Russian political situation looks pretty gloomy on one level, but on another, from another perspective, of course, it may well mean that Putin can sell to his own population that he's been victorious regardless of the outcome and regardless of the compromises he might have to make. But it seems at this stage that no real negotiations are going to be undertaken or commitments given until the results of this next offensive become known. And assuming that that just means that you get a new stalemate, how do you see the negotiations opening up, if at all, after that?
Okay. Well, I think both sides want to negotiate from a position of strength. And that's why it's continued on the way it has, and that's why we've had these sham negotiations up until now. The interesting thing is we don't know what the level of casualties has been. The American and British intelligence has been talking about 15,000 or something Russian casualties. We don't know whether that's true. We don't know how many Ukrainians have died. We don't know how many Ukrainian fighting men have died. We don't know how much of the Ukrainian fighting materiel has been destroyed. What we do know is that the Russians have not stopped, and have not tried to stop, the supply of material and weapons from the West reaching Ukraine. They haven't tried to cut it off, which you would think would be one of the first things that you would do. And I suspect that's because they're as worried about escalation to nuclear activity as the West is. So I think there's a lot of worries on both sides going on here. But in terms of your basic question about how about negotiations and how to get out of it, I mean, I think there are four issues. One is withdrawal of ceasefire and withdrawal of forces, and ultimately at some stage that'll happen. It has to happen. It can't go on forever. The second issue will be the state of the two self-proclaimed republics in Donbass, which is also been crucial to the whole thing. I think the compromise solution, if you can call it that, will be that Ukraine will adopt a semi-federal system so that they will get some autonomy. The Ukrainians agreed to that in the Minsk discussions in 2014-15 and then withdrew from it. And they argued that they didn't want to do that because that would give those areas a special advantage over the rest of the country. But I think if the Russians are in control of those areas, or if the irredentists there, the pro-Russian forces are in control, supported by the Russian army, well, I don't think they're going to have an option. And that would be, I think that would be preferable for Putin, to leave them in Ukraine, because he doesn't have to pay for them then. But also, talking about fifth columns, it embeds within the Ukrainian polity two basic centres of pro-Russian sentiment. And there's going to be precious little pro-Russian sentiment anywhere else in the country because of what's happened. So I think Putin would accept them having some autonomy within Ukraine. The question is whether Zelensky would. The next issue is NATO membership. Zelensky has said before Bucha that he was willing for NATO to be neutral. I think that's what Putin has said he wants as well. So I think there can be agreement. There can be agreement there. It would need to be neutrality which was guaranteed on both sides. There's been talk of it being guaranteed by the UN Security Council, or the permanent members of the Security Council, and there's been talk of it being guaranteed by a combination of the Brits, the Germans and the Americans on one side and the Russians on the other. But I think that's probably sort of within reach, or at least doable. The big issue is Crimea. And the strip of land that stretches from Crimea up to Russia itself. This is why Mariupol is so important. Right? We hear a lot about the devastation of Mariupol. Both sides know that if whoever controls Mariupol will control that strip of land from Crimea to Russia itself. So they're tied up. And the Ukrainians have said they're not going to give up Crimea. Russia's said we're not going to give up Crimea, it's part of the Russian motherland. So there's no room for movement. I mean, I suspect if there is a real desire to get an end to the conflict and to bring about some sort of resolution of it all, what they'll do is they'll fudge. And they'll say, okay, it stays where it is for 15 years, and or whatever the period is, and then we return to it. Now, I don't know whether either side will agree to that, but it seems to me that that is the crucial point, given that I think there can be agreement on the other three issues. But again, it's it's a guess and looking at what's been said.
Terrific. You've been very generous in your answers. I regret that we have no more time for questions, accepting that those of you who are here are very welcome, I'm sure, to continue the discussion after we close down.